They say life can change in the blink of an eye, and I never truly understood what that meant until that fateful spring day. The memory is etched into my soul like a photograph seared by lightning. Every detail vivid and sharp, every emotion still raw and real. I was sitting at my desk that afternoon, sunlight streaming through my office window, casting shadows on the stack of reports I'd been reviewing. When my phone rang, it was like any other call, until it wasn't. The formal voice on the other end spoke words that would tear my world apart, asking if I was Jennifer Johnson. Then came the news that felt like a physical blow. My parents, my wonderful, vibrant parents, had been killed instantly in a highway accident. At that moment, I felt as if I was falling through space, my mind refusing to accept what my ears were hearing. The world I had known for many years, the one anchored by Sunday dinners and morning phone calls with Mom, by Dad's corny jokes and their unconditional love, had shattered into a million pieces. The next few days passed in a fog of grief, wrapped in the embraces of well-meaning friends who couldn't possibly understand the depth of my loss. But through it all, my 15-year-old daughter Mia became my lifeline, my reason to keep breathing, to keep putting one foot in front of the other. She carried her own grief with such grace, showing a maturity that both broke my heart and filled it with pride. One night, as we huddled together on our worn family sofa, the same one where we'd shared so many moments with Mom and Dad, Mia shared her wisdom. Her words about her grandparents still being present in every corner of our home touched something deep within my grieving heart. At that moment, I realized that while I had lost my parents, I still had this remarkable daughter who needed me to show the same strength they had taught me. When I learned about inheriting my childhood home, it felt like both a blessing and a burden. The two-story colonial with its wraparound porch and Mom's beloved orange trees in the backyard held every childhood memory I'd ever treasured. Each room whispered stories of Christmases past, of homework at the kitchen table, of teenage heartbreaks soothed with Mom's chocolate chip cookies. Initially, I wondered if living among these memories would be like residing in a museum of loss. But gradually, I began to see it as what it truly was. A bridge between past and future, a place where Mia and I could honor our roots while growing new branches. Moving in became a journey through time, each box we unpacked holding pieces of my parents' lives. Dad's old wall clock, the one he'd tinker with every Sunday after church, still hung silent but full of stories. Mom's cookbook, its pages stained with vanilla extract and sprinkled with her handwritten notes, felt like a conversation waiting to happen. Then came the letter in Dad's study, hidden among his favorite books, and my hands trembled like autumn leaves as I opened it. Their words, written in preparation for a day they hoped would never come, wrapped around me like a warm embrace. They spoke of their enduring love, of their pride in the woman and mother I'd become. They reminded me that this house had witnessed 4 generations of our family's story, from my first steps to Mia's first words. Their letter entrusted me not just with a house, but with a legacy of love and memories. They encouraged me to be strong, not with empty platitudes, but with the deep understanding of parents who had watched their children face life's storms. Their final wish for my happiness felt like a gentle command, a reminder that grief shouldn't overshadow the joy of living. As I read their words over and over, my tears fell like summer rain, each drop carrying both sorrow and gratitude. That evening, sharing a quiet dinner with Mia in our new kitchen, I felt the first whisper of peace since the accident. Watching her push her salad around her plate, just like Mom used to do, I felt overwhelming love surge through my heart. When I suggested planting flowers in the garden, it felt like extending an olive branch to the future. Mia's suggestion of roses, Mom's favorites that had lined our garden path every summer of my childhood, brought fresh tears to my eyes. That night, standing in the familiar hallway that had witnessed both my first date and Mia's first steps, I looked around at what was now our home. This house, which at first seemed like a monument to grief, now feels like a warm embrace. I've come to realize it's a place for healing, growth, and celebrating my parents' memory. After tucking Mia into bed, I kissed her forehead, feeling the familiar softness of her skin. I whispered to her that tomorrow would be a new day, hearing my mother's words echo through my own. She sleepily told me good night, fighting back a yawn. When I told her I loved her, she responded that she loved me more than I could ever imagine. Walking to my room, I felt a whirlwind of emotions sweeping through me. The shadow of loss still lingered in my heart like a familiar ache. But there was hope too. Hope for the future, for new memories in this house, and for the life Mia and I would build together. Lying in what was once my parents' bed, I closed my eyes, feeling the soft cotton sheets against my skin. For the first time in weeks, I drifted off to sleep without tears staining my pillow. Instead, I felt an unexpected sense of peace settling over me like a comfortable blanket. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, as smooth as freshly fallen snow. There would be days when the pain would crash over me like waves against the shore. But I knew I had the strength to face whatever came my way. I had a home, a daughter, and my parents' eternal love to guide me. Tomorrow was a new day, and we were ready to face it together. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, our life in this family home slowly took shape. Mia and I gradually settled into our new routine, layering fresh memories over old ones like a bittersweet symphony. But while we seemed to be blossoming in this new chapter of our lives, I sensed something strange happening with my husband Sean. At first, I attributed his changes and distant behavior to grief. After all, he too had lost his in-laws, people he'd grown to cherish. Yet as time passed, his behavior became increasingly puzzling and erratic, like a familiar song playing off-key. One Sunday morning, while I was preparing breakfast, I heard Sean speaking in hushed tones on the phone in his study. His voice was tense, almost conspiratorial, setting off alarm bells in my mind. Fighting my guilt, but driven by concern, I crept closer to the door. I overheard him telling his mother that this wasn't the right time, his voice strained like a taut wire. He continued, saying they had to be patient because I was still vulnerable, admitting he hadn't told me anything yet, but promising he would soon. A cold knot formed in my stomach like winter frost. What was Sean discussing with his mother Deborah? What wasn't he telling me? Before I could process the questions swirling in my mind like autumn leaves, I heard him moving toward the door. I hurried away, pretending to be busy with breakfast preparations. He entered the kitchen, his footsteps heavy with secrets. He greeted me with a morning kiss on my cheek, his lips feeling like strangers. I noticed how his eyes wouldn't meet mine like birds avoiding a storm. He asked about his briefcase, saying he needed to go to the office. When I questioned why he needed to work on a Sunday, reminding him we hadn't spent time as a family in ages, he visibly stiffened, like a deer catching a hunter's scent. He apologized, explaining it was an important project he couldn't delay, promising we'd spend time together next week. With that, he was gone, leaving me with cold toast and a heavier heart. That evening, when Sean finally came home, I tried to discuss our future plans. When I asked him about where he saw us in 5 or 10 years, his answers were as vague as fog on a morning lake. He just said we should live in the present, his smile never reaching his eyes, questioning why we needed to worry about the future now. But I couldn't help worrying, watching him drift away like a boat without an anchor. Day by day, Sean grew more distant, no longer sharing his work troubles or discussing plans and dreams. We had become like strangers sharing a house, our marriage as fragile as spring ice. One afternoon, while cleaning our bedroom, I found a crumpled paper in his jacket pocket. It was a real estate agency flyer, and my heart stopped like a wind-up clock running down. Was Sean planning to move? Why hadn't he said anything to me? That night, after Mia went to bed, I confronted Sean in the living room. Fighting to keep my voice steady as autumn leaves in a gentle breeze, I told him I'd found something in his jacket. When I showed him the flyer, I asked if there was anything he wanted to tell me. I caught a flash of panic in his eyes, like a deer in headlights, before he quickly composed himself. He forced a laugh, explaining it away as something from a colleague who was considering property investment there. I wanted desperately to believe him, to think I was just being paranoid, like an old woman jumping at shadows. But something deep in my heart, as certain as the changing of seasons, told me he was still hiding something. The next few days were like walking on broken glass. Every time Sean took a phone call, he would walk away to speak in private, his footsteps echoing with secrets. When he came home from work, he would shut himself in his study for hours, claiming he was working on an important project. Yet whenever I asked about this project, his answers were as insubstantial as morning mist. One night, my patience finally wore as thin as old lace. After Sean had fallen asleep, I crept into his study, my heart drumming against my ribs like a trapped bird. Despite the guilt of invading his privacy gnawing at me like a hungry wolf, my need for truth drove me forward. What I found on his computer froze me solid as a January morning. There were emails to real estate agents, inquiries about local schools, and a draft resignation letter from his current job. Everything pointed to Sean orchestrating some grand plan, like a conductor leading an orchestra I couldn't hear. It was clear our life was about to change dramatically, yet I was being kept in the dark like a child. That night, sleep evaded me like a shy cat as I lay staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning like a carnival wheel. I wondered why Sean was keeping such enormous secrets from me, whether he no longer trusted me, or if there was some other reason I couldn't bear to consider. The next morning, after Sean left for work, I called my best friend Nicole. My voice trembling like wind chimes in a storm, I confided my fears about Sean hiding something significant. Nicole responded with the calm of a summer lake, asking if I tried talking to him directly. I explained how he always deflected my questions, and how he seemed to be planning a move without consulting me. A silence stretched between us, long as a country mile. Finally, Nicole spoke, saying she'd known Sean for years and couldn't believe he would make such plans without discussing them with me. She insisted there must be an explanation. I wanted to believe her words like a farmer believes in the rain during a drought. Yet with each passing day, the distance between us grew like shadows at sunset. One evening, while preparing dinner, I overheard Mia talking to Sean in the garden. My heart nearly stopped when I heard her asking why he was spending so much time with his mother lately, saying I was worried. Sean's tension-filled response, asking her to keep quiet about it to avoid worrying me unnecessarily, felt like ice water in my veins. That night, after Sean had fallen asleep, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, trying to piece together this puzzle like an old quilt. Deborah had always been a complicated figure in our relationship, as difficult to handle as a thorny rose. From the beginning, she had made it clear she didn't think I was good enough for her son, and our relationship was as delicate as fine china ever since. The knowledge that Sean was secretly spending time with her filled me with dread as deep as winter darkness. The following days became an exercise in anxiety, each late return home and secret message feeling like another stone in my stomach. My attempts to talk with him were met with excuses as flimsy as paper umbrellas in a storm. During one quiet dinner, Mia's small, frightened voice cut through the silence like a knife. She asked if everything was all right, noting how we barely talked anymore like we used to. Sean and I exchanged awkward glances across the table like strangers at a funeral. I forced a smile, telling Mia everything was fine, that we were just tired. But nothing was fine, not really. Day by day, I felt something crumbling like an old foundation, though I couldn't quite name what it was. That day started like any other, as ordinary as old cotton sheets. I woke early to make Mia's breakfast, saw her off to school, and headed to work, following the familiar rhythm of our lives. Yet my mind kept drifting back home like a compass seeking north, unable to focus on anything but our problems. Thoughts of Sean's tension, his secrets, and Deborah's shadow swirled in my mind like leaves in an autumn storm. By the time I finished work, I was exhausted in body and soul, worn thin as old paper. I had planned to go home, take a hot bath, and perhaps find the courage to talk to Sean one more time. But fate, that old trickster, had other plans waiting in the wings. Arriving home, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked in front of our house, sending chills down my spine like winter rain. We weren't expecting visitors, and Sean hadn't mentioned anyone coming over this morning. With my heart beating like a trapped bird, I inserted my key and opened the door. The sight before me stopped me as cold as a January morning. Our usually neat and welcoming entryway was overflowing with boxes and suitcases like a storage unit come to life. Some boxes gaped open, spilling clothes and personal items like secrets finally revealed. Others stood sealed and stacked, ready for a moving truck like soldiers awaiting orders. My voice trembled like autumn leaves as I called out to Sean, demanding an explanation. Sounds came from the living room, and Sean appeared in the hallway, his face as pale as old porcelain. Tension twisted his features as if he carried the weight of worlds on his shoulders. He started to speak, his voice unnaturally strained, saying we needed to talk. But before he could continue, another figure emerged behind him, making my blood run cold as winter frost. There stood Deborah, Sean's mother, in my house like a queen claiming her territory. She wore a smile that didn't reach her eyes, her voice dripping with false sweetness and triumph as she announced we would all be living together. I stood frozen, trying to process this news like a computer struggling with corrupted data. Sean stepped forward, his face a mixture of guilt and determination like a child confessing a major transgression. He tried to explain, saying he knew it was sudden but it was for everyone's good, that his mother needed our help. I cut him off, my voice finally breaking free like a dam giving way, asking what he meant and how he could make such a decision about our home, my parents' home, without consulting me. Deborah interjected with her sugar-coated yet razor-sharp voice, calling me dear, while explaining how wonderful it would be, how she could help with Mia and cook for everyone, like one big happy family. The room began to spin like a carnival ride gone wrong, and I felt as if I couldn't breathe. It seemed impossible, like being trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. I managed to ask Sean for a private conversation, struggling to maintain my composure like a tightrope walker in a storm. But before we could move, the front door opened again, and Mia walked in with her backpack, stopping short at the scene before her. Her eyes darted between us all like a frightened bird, asking what was happening. Deborah immediately embraced her, announcing with sugary enthusiasm that she would be living with us, asking wasn't it wonderful? Mia stiffened like a statue in her grandmother's embrace, her confused and anxious eyes seeking mine across the room. She asked slowly if I had known about this, her voice small and uncertain. I felt tears welling up, but held them back like a dam holding floodwaters, determined not to break down in front of Deborah. I answered my daughter with a voice as steady as old oak, telling her that no, this was as much a surprise to me as it was to her. Sean flinched at my words like a guilty child caught in a lie. He mumbled about meaning to talk to me, saying he was just waiting for the right moment. I echoed his words about timing with disbelief heavy in my voice, asking if that meant after all the boxes were moved in and Deborah was settled in the guest room. Deborah's artificial smile hung like a cheap painting as she told me not to be so dramatic, insisting I would come to appreciate this arrangement. Anger boiled inside me like water in a kettle left too long on the stove. I couldn't fathom how they could do this, how Sean could betray my trust like glass shattering on concrete. Struggling to maintain composure for our daughter's sake, I asked Mia to go to her room while I spoke with her father. She gave me one more worried glance, like a frightened fawn, before climbing the stairs. After hearing her door close, I turned to face Sean and Deborah with steel in my spine. I demanded an explanation, my voice as firm as mountain stone. Sean's words tumbled out like rushing water, explaining his mother's financial troubles had forced her to sell her house. He said she had nowhere else to go, and he thought we could help. As if it were that simple. I pressed him further, my disbelief as sharp as winter wind, asking how he could make such decisions about my parents' house without consulting me. Deborah interrupted, her voice syrupy sweet as carnival cotton candy, suggesting I consider all she could do. Watching Mia, cooking, cleaning. I addressed her with the composure of a judge delivering a verdict, acknowledging her offer while explaining that wasn't the issue. The problem was this decision being made behind my back, like thieves in the night. When Sean tried to approach me, I stepped back like a deer avoiding a hunter. He pleaded with me, promising to explain, claiming his mother would only stay for a few months. But his tone and inability to meet my eyes set off alarms like sirens in my mind. I cut him off with the firmness of a teacher ending a disruptive discussion. Turning to Deborah, I apologized but told her she couldn't stay tonight, not until Sean and I reached an agreement. Deborah swelled with anger like a thundercloud ready to burst, asking if I meant to throw out my husband's mother. I maintained my composure like a ship's captain in a storm, explaining I was only asking for time to resolve this as a family. Sean's eyes darted between his mother and me like a pendulum, before finally suggesting she might need to stay at a hotel, at least until he could talk things through. Deborah's voice rose like thunder, expressing disbelief at her son's betrayal, reminding him of all she had done. The tension in the room felt thick as summer humidity, ready to break like a storm. But before anyone could speak, footsteps on the stairs drew our attention like a bell cutting through fog. Mia appeared in the hallway, her expression a mixture of determination and tension, like a young warrior preparing for battle. She began to speak slowly, her words followed by a silence as heavy as lead. We all focused on her as she stood at the bottom of the stairs, meeting our eyes with unexpected strength. In that moment, I forgot my anger and confusion, my attention completely captured by my daughter. I gently suggested she return to her room, reminding her this was a conversation for her father and me. But Mia interrupted with a voice stronger than I'd ever heard, like steel wrapped in silk. Sean stepped forward, worry etched on his face like lines in weathered wood, asking his princess to return to her room while the adults talked. Mia's voice took on an edge I'd never heard before as she questioned what they meant by important talk. When my daughter mentioned the plan to deceive me, I watched the color drain from Sean's face like water from a sink. Deborah's anger vanished too, replaced by a look I can only describe as someone who'd seen a ghost walking through our living room. "What's going on?" I asked, feeling my stomach twist into knots the way it did before my first job interview years ago. I heard Mia take a deep breath, and to my surprise, she let out a dry laugh that seemed so unlike her. It was almost adult-like, reminding me of how quickly she was growing up. My heart nearly stopped as I watched my daughter tell her father that he really thought she didn't know anything. I could see Sean starting to shake, not just a slight tremor, but the kind of visible shaking you get when you step out into a bitter winter wind without your coat. His face transformed from that mixture of guilt and determination into pure, undiluted fear, the same look I'd seen on my father's face when he had to tell us about losing his job during the recession. Sean tried to interject, stammering that he didn't know what she was talking about and suggesting they discuss it, his voice barely above a whisper. But Mia cut him off with a composure that frightened me more than any teenage outburst ever could, declaring there would be no more lies, no more secrets. I turned to my daughter, my mind racing with questions about what she knew and why she'd kept it bottled up inside like I used to do at her age. "Sweetheart," I said softly, trying to keep my voice as steady as my mother's always was in crisis, "what's happening? What do you know?" My daughter looked at me with eyes full of apology, like windows into her soul, before turning back to Sean and Deborah to begin her story. She told us how she'd been watching, listening, and investigating, sounding more like the detective shows I used to watch than my little girl. Deborah stepped forward, wearing concern on her face like an ill-fitting mask, suggesting that Mia must be confused, trying to dismiss it as complex adult conversations that young ears might misunderstand. My daughter's response came sharp and clear, insisting she wasn't a child anymore and that she understood everything perfectly. Sean looked like he might collapse, his face as pale as the sheets my grandmother used to hang on the clothesline, sweat beading on his forehead like morning dew. He pleaded with her to stop, his voice trembling like wind chimes in a storm. But Mia continued with the kind of calm that comes before a tornado. I'd seen enough of those growing up in the Midwest to recognize it. She explained how she'd noticed her father acting strange weeks ago, always on the phone in whispers, changing the subject whenever she walked into the room. She told us how at first, she thought it was work, just like when I used to worry about layoffs at the factory. Then she described that one night. She paused, and I could see her struggling to contain her emotions like a dam holding back a flood. My heart shattered watching her carry this burden alone, just as I'd carried so many secrets in my youth. She went on to reveal how she'd heard her father talking to Grandma Deborah. Then came the words that changed everything. She told me they had been discussing selling our house. The words hit me like a physical blow, the way it felt when I heard about losing my own childhood home. Selling our house. This house. The one my parents left us? I heard my voice crack like thin ice on a winter pond. That's impossible. But my daughter wasn't finished, and her next revelation fell like heavy stones into still water. She continued, explaining how her father had talked about using the money to pay off Grandma's debts and start a new business. Deborah's reaction was immediate, a sharp gasp followed by an angry outburst, demanding that Sean stop our daughter from spreading what she called fabrications. But Sean stood silent as a cemetery at midnight. My daughter insisted these weren't fabrications, her voice trembling but holding firm like an old oak in a storm. She told us about having proof. Every document from her father's desk, the sale plans, realtor estimates, even draft contracts. I looked into Sean's eyes, searching for any sign that this was all a misunderstanding, like the time my father had to explain selling my childhood dog, but what I saw there confirmed every word Mia had spoken. How could you do this? I whispered, feeling my world crumble like the old family photos I'd been meaning to preserve. Finally, Sean found his voice, though it quivered like autumn leaves, trying to explain that it wasn't what I thought, that he had only wanted to secure our future and make a fresh start for all of us. A new start? I repeated, my voice filled with disbelief like an empty church echoing hollow prayers. By selling my parents' house, lying to me, deceiving me? Deborah tried to intervene, calling me her dear one, pleading that while things might look bad, they just needed a chance to explain. Enough. My voice came out stronger than I'd ever heard it, like thunder across an open prairie. I don't want to hear any more lies. Both of you, get out of this house right now. I watched Sean step forward, his eyes begging like a stray dog in the rain, trying to make me understand that he had a plan, that everything would work out. But Mia cut him off again, her voice now barely above a whisper, telling me I hadn't heard the worst part yet. A chill ran down my spine like ice water in January. What could be worse than this? I asked, fear gripping my heart like a frozen fist. What else is there? I watched my daughter take a deep breath, gathering strength like a swimmer before the final lap. Then she revealed their plan after selling the house. How Sean and Deborah intended to separate me from her, using my parents' deaths as an excuse to commit me to a mental facility. In that moment, time seemed to stop, like an old clock winding down its final tick. Her words echoed in my head while my heart refused to process them. Put me in a facility? Separate me from my own daughter? Sean stood frozen like he'd been struck by lightning, his mouth moving but no sound emerging. Deborah had lost all her previous arrogance, now appearing as insubstantial as a shadow at dusk. She finally managed to croak out that it was all lies, that it couldn't be true. But my daughter, with a composure that chilled me to the bone, quietly pulled out her smartphone. She told us, her voice steady as a surgeon's hand, that she had recorded everything. Every word of their conversation about the plan. The silence that followed her words was deafening, like the moment after a bomb drops, but before it explodes. Time seemed suspended, the living room frozen in a tableau of betrayal. Sean's face had turned ghostly pale, while Deborah seemed to age a decade in mere seconds. I felt the floor beneath me dissolving like sand in an hourglass. Mia showed no mercy, pulling out her phone with trembling hands and playing the recording. Sean's voice filled the room, explaining to Deborah how after selling the house, they could use my grief as reason to take me to a psychiatric facility, claiming I wasn't fit to raise Mia. Deborah's recorded voice followed, questioning the risks, asking about potential resistance from me or Mia. Sean's cold response detailed how he would take custody of Mia if necessary, claiming it would be best for her. When the recording ended, silence filled the room like thick fog on a winter morning. Sean had gone pale as a ghost, while Deborah looked ready to collapse, fragile as autumn leaves. And I felt my world crumbling like the old photos in my parents' album. Why? I whispered toward Sean, my voice cracking like thin ice. Why could you do this? How could you even think of separating me from my daughter? Sean's tear-filled response about doing everything for the family, about paying off his mother's debts and building a new future, felt hollow as a dead tree. A future? My voice trembled like a leaf in a storm. With lies and betrayal? By separating me from my daughter? When Deborah tried to speak again, I cut her off. Enough, I shouted, the word echoing off the walls like a gunshot. I don't want to hear anymore. Both of you, get out of this house right now. I felt Mia's hand slip into mine as she softly apologized for not telling me sooner, explaining how she'd been afraid I wouldn't believe her. I pulled her close, grateful for her courage and loyalty. It's all right, sweetheart, I whispered into her hair. You did the right thing. I watched as Sean made one last desperate attempt to approach us, pleading that everything had been done out of love, for the family. I stared at him, shaking my head while 30 years of marriage crumbled like autumn leaves beneath my feet. Love? I said softly, each word falling like heavy stones into still water. Love doesn't betray, it doesn't lie, and it certainly doesn't tear a mother from her child. What you did isn't love. It's nothing but selfishness wrapped in pretty excuses. In that moment, the man before me transformed from my husband into a stranger wearing familiar clothes. Deborah, realizing she was losing her carefully constructed web of lies, made one final desperate attempt. She spoke about Mia's future, about how the new business would give her everything she'd ever dreamed of. But my brave, beautiful daughter spoke before I could, her quiet voice carrying the weight of mountains. She told them that all she'd ever dreamed of was a family bound by love and respect. Her words hung in the air like the last note of a funeral hymn. The silence that followed was thick with pain, anger, and undeniable truth. Sean stood trembling, his face ashen as he desperately searched for an escape route like a trapped animal. But something in Mia's stance, the way she gripped her phone like a shield, told me there was more to come. My heart, already shattered like depression glass, steeled itself for what might come next. Mia, I said quietly, taking her hand like my mother used to take mine during thunderstorms. Is there more? She looked at me with eyes that held both determination and pain, deep as wells in a drought. She nodded slowly, her resolve firm as oak roots. There is, Mom, she said, her voice small but crystal clear. Sean stepped forward, his voice quivering like leaves in an autumn wind, begging her to stop, claiming they could fix things. But Mia cut him off, insisting I had the right to know everything. She turned to me and explained how she'd begun recording their conversations after overhearing the initial plans. Her trembling fingers opened the recording app, revealing weeks of collected conversations. As she pressed play, Sean's voice filled the room like poison gas. I listened as they discussed their careful planning, Deborah's cold voice following with talk of facilities and ensuring no one would believe me. Sean's worried questions about resistance were met with Deborah's chilling response about sedatives keeping me compliant. When the recording ended, silence fell like a heavy shroud. Sean collapsed to his knees, his face twisted with terror and shame like a child caught in an unforgivable act. Deborah stood frozen, transformed into a statue of salt like Lot's wife. How? I whispered, my voice barely a breath in the stillness. How could you plan to lock me away and drug me into submission, to tear me away from my child? Sean's weak protests about things getting out of hand sounded hollow as an empty church. Out of hand? I echoed, my voice trembling like disturbed water. This wasn't an accident or a mistake. You plotted this like architects of destruction. When Deborah tried to speak, my anger cut through her words like a blade through silk. I turned to Mia, my heart swelling with gratitude for her courage. She explained how she'd learned to access Sean's phone, her voice laced with pain but her eyes bright with determination. She detailed how she'd installed apps to record calls and used skills from her electronics course to capture their conversations at home. A complex mixture of pain and pride washed over me like waves on a shore. My little girl had sacrificed her innocence to protect me, showing wisdom and bravery beyond her years. The words caught in my throat like cotton candy dissolving in rain. Mia. I whispered, my heart overflowing with a mixture of gratitude and regret that felt as vast as the ocean. Thank you, my brave girl, for protecting me, for bringing the truth to light, but I'm so sorry you had to carry this burden alone. As Mia wrapped her arms around me, the warmth of her embrace reminded me of the quilts my grandmother used to make, layers of love stitched together with care and devotion. She told me, her voice steady as a lighthouse beam, that we were a team, that she couldn't bear the thought of anything happening to me. Those words brought tears to my eyes, flowing like spring rain after a long drought. Of course we are, my precious one. Sean, who had been standing as still as those porcelain figurines my mother used to collect, finally broke his silence. His plea came out weak and trembling, like the last notes of a dying music box. He tried to justify their actions through a maze of excuses. About giving me peace, helping me overcome grief, about the promise of a new business venture. I stared at this stranger wearing my husband's face, searching for any trace of the man I'd loved for decades. My voice shook like autumn leaves in a storm as I challenged his notion of good intentions, pointing out the cruel reality of their plans to drug me, institutionalize me, tear me from my child. Deborah made one final attempt, her words rising like steam from a bitter cup of coffee, speaking of family and fresh starts as if they were items on a grocery list. But my daughter, my precious Mia, cut through their pretense like a blade through spider webs. The truth in her words rang clear as a church bell on Sunday morning as she spoke about what real family means: protection, not destruction, love, not lies. Get out, I commanded, my voice carrying the weight of long years of shattered dreams. Don't come back, Mia and I are family enough. When Sean took a step toward us, my brave girl stood like a sentinel, warning him about the recorded evidence she held. I watched my husband and his mother gather their belongings like mourners at a funeral they'd arranged themselves. Sean's parting attempt at an apology hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle, meaningless and dispersing into nothing. The door closed with the finality of a book being shut forever. Mia and I stood embracing in the aftermath, like survivors of a storm we never saw coming. The future stretched before us, uncharted as the sea, but we were together, that was our anchor. What do we do now, Mom? Mia's gentle question floated between us like a leaf on still water. I held her closer, feeling strength flow between us like the current of a mighty river. We start over, my precious girl, together. Building something beautiful on a foundation of trust and truth. The remnants of their lives still scattered around our room looked like debris from an emotional shipwreck. Our known world had crumbled, but we were ready to chart a new course through these unknown waters. "Are you okay, Mom?" Mia's voice wrapped around me like a warm shawl on a cold evening. "I am," I managed, though my smile trembled like a candle flame in the wind. "Because I have you." We sat together on the sofa, letting the weight of the day settle around us like evening shadows in a familiar room. The wounds were deep, but our resolve was stronger, rooted like an old oak that has weathered countless storms. "We'll be okay," Mia whispered, her smile blooming like the first flower of spring. "We're a team." In that moment, I saw my little girl transformed. No longer just my child, but my partner in survival, my compass in this storm. "Mia," I began, searching for words worthy of this moment, this gift of truth she'd given us. "You saved us." "Thank you." She squeezed my hand, tears glistening in her eyes like morning dew as she reminded me of how I'd always protected her too, how we'd always been in this together. Her confession came in waves. How terrified she'd been, but how she couldn't stand by and watch them hurt me or tear us apart. I pulled her close, finally letting my own tears fall like summer rain on parched earth. "I understand, my brave, beautiful girl. Thank you, but I'm so sorry you had to carry such a heavy burden alone. We made our pact then, as ancient and sacred as a prayer. No more secrets between us, no matter what storms might come." Mia nodded against my shoulder, sealing our promise with the quiet certainty of absolute truth. "No more secrets," we whispered together, our voices blending like music in an empty church. For a long while, we stayed wrapped in each other's arms on the sofa, like two survivors in a storm shelter. Reality was slowly seeping in around us, like morning fog rolling over familiar hills, as our home felt like a fragile bubble protected from the tempest outside. When Mia finally pulled back slightly, her eyes met mine with a mixture of curiosity and concern, like a child testing thin ice. Her question about Sean and Deborah's next moves hung in the air between us like smoke from a dying fire. I released a deep sigh, heavy as old church doors, considering her words carefully. I assured her that with the evidence she'd gathered, we were prepared for whatever might come. Her next question about involving the police caught me off guard, like a sudden gust through an open window. "We could," I responded thoughtfully, weighing each word like precious stones. "The evidence is there, but is that what you want, sweetheart?" I watched her ponder this, her young face carrying wisdom beyond her years. She confessed her conflicted feelings. Torn between wanting justice and yearning to move forward, like a boat caught between two shores. "I understand completely," I nodded, my heart aching like an old wound in winter. "We don't need to decide right now. Some choices need time to ripen, like summer fruit." Hand in hand, we made our way to the kitchen, our steps falling into a natural rhythm. I suggested redecorating, making this space truly ours, and watched my daughter's face light up like a sunrise. Her enthusiasm for blue wallpaper sparked something in both of us. We weren't just planning home improvements, we were rebuilding our lives. When she asked about forgiveness, her question struck me like a church bell at midnight. I chose my words carefully, explaining how forgiveness was a journey, not a destination. She nodded with understanding beyond her years, reminding me again that we were a team. Later that night, after Mia had drifted off to sleep like a boat finding safe harbor, I sat alone with my tea, like a sentinel at dawn. The pain of Sean and Deborah's betrayal still lay fresh in my chest like a new wound, but there was also strength there, surprising as spring flowers through snow. My eyes fell on the old photographs hanging on our walls, moments frozen in time like insects in amber. Slowly, deliberately, I took them down, storing them away like pressing flowers between pages. Part of our history, but not our destiny. In their place, I hung new photos of Mia and me, candid shots of us laughing in the garden, symbols of hope bright as morning glories opening to the sun. As I settled into bed, a gentle peace washed over me like warm summer rain. The pain wouldn't vanish overnight. There would be difficult days and tear-stained nights ahead, like stations on a long journey. But I knew, with the certainty of stars in a clear night sky, that Mia and I would weather whatever storms might come. "We are strong," I whispered into the darkness, like a prayer. Sean's world had crumbled, but from those ashes, Mia and I would build something new. Strong as oak roots, beautiful as wildflowers, founded on trust and truth. This was our new family, small but mighty as a lighthouse in a storm.